The final module of our Instructor Fundamentals course is about risk management. Managing risk is an incredibly important part of being an instructor because your students are going to be attempting new maneuvers, new procedures in new environments where they may never have flown before, and certainly where they are not proficient. But you're going to have to give them the controls. You're going to have to put them in charge and let them run the situation, while at the same time ensuring that they stay safe, the crew stays safe, anybody on the ground stays safe for the ship. And there are a lot of techniques that we use to promote good risk management, and one of them is the idea of defensive posturing. When we talk about defensive posturing, most people think of control guarding. The idea of the instructor riding along on the controls and sometimes even providing inputs while the student is flying, although a good instructor is going to strive to shadow the controls without actually putting in any inputs so that the student can see the actual outcomes of the control inputs that they're making. Now, sometimes if you have to step in as an instructor to make a correction or prevent your student from doing something that would result in harm to them or the aircraft or someone else, that's important, and that's why we guard the controls. But as long as things are going well, you want to avoid making actual control inputs. But defensive posturing is so much more than just control guarding, and we can see here that these two aircraft are both conducting various forms of fast rope insertion extraction type training. Looks like this aircraft here is doing a litter hoist, but they're doing them in very different environments, and the defensive posture of this instructor is going to need to be a lot higher than this instructor. This instructor here is over a prepared flight deck. It may be hard to tell from the image, but it's a big deck gator, and they're over a spot. They've even got an LSE here in the foreground, so push comes to shove, they could come right down onto that spot. They've got tower watching them. Most likely they've got good winds over the deck. This scenario is much more conducive to a safe outcome, but it may not be as representative of the actual environment in which a mission might take place. Here we've got the Atlas training vessel and an aircraft doing a pretty realistic and somewhat high-risk evolution, and here you are going to require a much higher defensive posture. There isn't a prepared spot underneath you. There's no good spot to come straight down to in the event of engine transmission issues, and there's the winds might not be necessarily in line with the aircraft. You're probably looking at a crosswind there, and you've got a lot more obstacles in close to the aircraft. So the defensive posture of the instructor is not just about control guarding, but it's about changing how you are inputting those controls. What are you letting the student do? How much latitude are you giving them? This instructor can probably give their student a fair amount of latitude to make mistakes and then correct them without having to intervene as the instructor. This instructor here is going to have to intervene either verbally or physically much more rapidly in order to prevent a dangerous situation from developing. Now, some of this also ties into concepts of energy management, and most people are familiar with EM diagrams, P sub S diagrams, but in this case, we're just talking about kind of some basic physics, and this will be sort of the physics for poets. We've taken all of the equations out of it, except for this really simple addition. But your total energy on the aircraft is a combination of your kinetic energy from rotor speed, kinetic energy from airspeed, and that's going to be best quantified in indicated airspeed, as well as potential energy captured in altitude and really demonstrated in AGL altitude. And from a physics standpoint, there's also a potential energy of your MSL altitude, but you can't really keep using it once you've found the ground. Now, you can trade energy in between these three sources, but if you have an existing energy state, you're not going to be able to increase any of these without having excess power available to add to it. So if I don't have excess power available, if I'm at a fixed, say, collective setting, and I'm starting to droop rotor speed, I can trade airspeed and execute essentially a flare maneuver, and that will spin up the rotor head, as anybody who's done autos is well familiar with, but at the cost of kinetic energy in airspeed. Or Along that same auto rotation theme, we could trade the potential energy of altitude for rotor speed by just reducing that collective, allowing the aircraft to descend, but reducing the pitch on the blades and bringing that rotor speed back up. But in that case, your total energy hasn't changed, and in fact, it's really decreased because you're always going to have some losses to frictional forces, heat, all of those places where energy kind of bleeds out. But until you have excess power available to add back into kind of this state, you want to think about where each one of these comes in. So rotor speed at the high end, as you start to overspeed, isn't necessarily going to provide you with a lot of energy available. Even if you're all the way up towards the upper limits of your rotor speed, that especially in an H60, that rotor speed can be traded off pretty quickly and doesn't necessarily provide you a great bank of energy. For the most part, you're just going to let the systems keep that rotor speed at 100%, and you're not going to try to bank energy that way. Airspeed and altitude are certainly a great ways to bank energy, though, because you can use them in the event of a loss of rotor speed energy. So in the event that you are starting to lose some turns on the aircraft, that rotor speed is decaying, transferring energy from the other two sources can bring that back, because ultimately if rotor speed is allowed to decay enough, you can get a rotor stall, which isn't really covered very well in our NATOPS. I think most people just assume you're going to do whatever you have to do to prevent getting down there, but rotor stall is different from retreating blade stall in that it is when all four blades stall as a result of becoming so slow that the angle of attack on each blade is so high it reaches its critical angle and each blade stalls, at which point the helicopter is coming straight down, and even if you bottomed out the collective, there's really nothing you would do. You wouldn't put turns back on the system, you would just come down like a rocket, and that's why we are particular about guarding that NR, not letting it droop down low. In general, you can assume that rotor stall is gonna happen kind of in the low 80% NR range, but in general, that rotor stall speed increases 1 to 2% NR per 1,000 feet density altitude as you go up. So at high density altitudes, that rotor stall speed could even reach up towards 90%. Now, your airspeed and your altitude, you can see as the energy is traded, high airspeed, high energy, low airspeed, low energy, and same with altitude. When we approach energy management from an instructional perspective, one of the things to think about is an example of you're flying in Fallon. You're headed from the airfield out to Dixie Valley, and the students have decided to take the direct route over the mountains. You're flying along out towards the range, and you're looking down maybe at a scenario script or a chart, and you look up and you realize the student is head on into the terrain, pointed right at the ridge line of the mountain. You look down and full collectives in, you're right at the limiter, and the NR is starting to droop, and it doesn't necessarily look like you're going to clear the ridge, but you're still at about 70 or 80 knots of airspeed. You could try to immediately execute a turn and turn away from the cliff line, but as soon as you introduce that turn, that horizontal component of lift is going to move up, that vertical component of lift is going to come down, and the aircraft is going to start to descend even more, and depending on your proximity to the ridgeline, you may not have enough altitude to give to make the turn. However, you can trade out that airspeed for maybe some of those turns you're starting to lose and that altitude that you need in order to clear that ridge, and just fix that collective, execute a slight cyclic pop to get up and over, and then maybe go back home if the event looks like it got off to a bad start, or see if you can salvage it and get your student back on track. But understanding where you have energy to trade in a scenario like that is very important, because if, say, your airspeed was already down to 40 or 50 knots, that maneuver is likely not available to you.